Welcome. I hope you can hear me well. Yes. First of all, I would like to say thank you, organizer, for this amazing event. And also, I would like to say thank you for everyone who joined this stream. We have a lot of great talks, and it's great to have you here. So I would like to talk about efficiency in test, which we can achieve by applying different practice. And I'm Alex. I'm an Android developer at Backbase. And yes, let's start. And as usual, everything start everything starts from the very beginning. Our project is pretty small. We add just a couple of screens or maybe just proof of concept. And later on, we have more and more test and screen, which can be advanced. But at the beginning, our application is pretty easy to test because it's just a couple of screens, most probably a pretty simple UI. Maybe this application even not public yet. But later on, we start thinking about adding some complications to our application, adding some additional screens, etc. So what can be such complications for us? And one of such complications can be we can start support different screens because we would like to get broader audience. Maybe we already starting support light and dark theme. Because light and dark theme is pretty popular nowadays, almost every application supported, and in addition to it, very often for some premium subscriptions, you have much more different themes. And if you take a look at applications which have like even five different screens, but we support multiple languages, we support multiple themes, when we try to test it, time is already increasing pretty fast. Especially if we, in addition to it, add different accessibility option, we start support left to right and right to left layout and locales. So scope is really increasing. And for testing even pretty small application by developer or by quality assurance engineer, it can be grow super fast. And in this case, we can start thinking about writing the test, and we start thinking how they can help us. And one of such approaches is think about different approaches which we can use and we can apply for UI tests. So let's start with it. And everything starts pretty simple because we have only two different types of tests in Android. It's local and instrumentation. Local test we run on our local JVM on our desktop workstation. This test works much faster because we don't need to copy application to different device, get data from this device. And instrumentation tests require device and emulator. It's a bit slower, but from other side, we can run our test on multiple devices simultaneously. It means that if we have device-specific issue, we can run our test on different devices, and we can be sure that everything works perfectly on different devices. And both local and instrumentation tests can be UI and non-UI. When we speak about non-UI tests, it can be testing database and business logic, etc. And when we speak about UI tests, in the local section, you can see the asterisk, and this asterisk means that for running tests with Android dependencies locally, we need to have some framework, and this framework is Roboelectric. And Roboelectric allows us to run even UI tests on our working station. But here we have some limitations, and such limitations is very often different views which has some swiping or scrolling, especially like navigation drawer and different more complicated views. But sometimes we also would like to share some data between local and instrumentation tests. We also would like to think about sharing some infrastructure, which can be very helpful for both local and instrumentation tests. And we can extract them into specific section and specific folder in our project. So by default, you have Android test and test folders, Android test for instrumentation test, and of course, test for local tests. In addition to it, we can introduce our common test section with updating a little bit our scripts and source set section. And in this case, everything which we put in common test will be available for both Android test and test folders. However, if you would like to reuse your shared test infrastructure for multiple modules, I highly recommend to extract it to separate module. But if you would like to have all this infrastructure only on one module, this common test solution can be great for you. And let's speak a bit more about different types of UI tests. And in the whole presentation, we will talk only about UI tests. So all UI tests can be split into user interface and snapshot tests. When we speak about user interface, we are mostly interested in some interaction here. As example, enter email, password, press login, and see what happened on the next screen as example, or see some error case which happened on the screen. From other side, when we speak about snapshot test, or sometimes you can people call them screenshot tests, here we're mostly interested about pixel perfectness, how our application feel and look on different devices. So, and today I would like to talk about both of these approaches. However, at the beginning, I would like to do one step back and take a look what happened when we would like to run any instrumentation test on device. And the first step is to build two applications. It's our main application and test application. So as a result, we will have two different applications. The next step, we install them on our device, and we can run adb shell aim instrument command, which will allow our test application interact with our main application. And in this case, with such interaction, we will have a test in progress. And right now we have main three big players, which are really interesting for us when we speak about UI tests. And everything started super simple. We had just activity and everything was pretty clear. Later on, fragment was introduced and some people start migrating to the fragment. But one of pretty big issue at that time is that we haven't really good guidance. How should we migrate? And as a result, we have a bit of hell in our code base because everyone starts using it differently. Some people start to use only activity and completely ignore fragments. Some people try to create one fragment for every activity, multiple fragments for one activity. And very often you can see, especially in some pretty old project, or maybe you remember, that you had a situation when some feature had one activity and multiple fragments, another feature had just activities without the fragments, and completely other approach, it's just to use views for whole screen. You have just one view which contains all user interface, and you just interact with the view which are attached to the activity. So we had multiple different approaches. And right now we have one more, which was introduced together with Jetpack Compose. And right now we have also composable views. And these composable functions, that composable functions can be like a small part of user interface or even whole screens. So right now we have three big players, but we all should remember that entry point to our application is only activity. So let's take a look at different testing possibilities which allow us to run every of these components. So first of all, we have launch activity methods, and we can pass our activity or our activity with parameter, or we also can pass specific intent. And with that approach, it's really great that we can also move to specific state of our activity lifecycle. When we would like to test fragment in isolation, in this case, we can use a launch fragment in container. But for it, we need to add a fragment testing dependency. And in this dependency on the slide, you can see that I use version 1.4.0 release candidate 01. And we need this release candidate version if we want to support Android 12. And the main reason of it you will see on the next slide. We know that activity is an entry point for our Android application. And what we really want to have is to run our activity. And what this framework do, that during compilation, this dependency, that during compilation, this empty fragment activity will be added to your Android manifest. And when you will use launch fragment in container, under the hood you will run empty fragment activity with required fragment. Something similar happened with Jetpack Compose rules. It's called Compose Content Test Rule. And when we use when we would like to use this dependency, this rule, we also need to add one dependency. It's called UI test manifest. And under the hood, our composable functions will be also added to our activity, but in this case, it's component activity, which will be added during compilation. Because without this activity, without this dependency, we need to add this activity manually to our manifest. So it's great that we have additional dependency which do all the stuff for us. And when we speak about Android tests and how different frameworks interact with Android application and allow us to test them, we also need to talk about different approaches for testing. When we speak about Espresso and Espresso-based framework, these frameworks interact with content of the application, like recycler view button, custom view inside application. However, we also sometimes would like to test different components which are outside of applications. As example, notification, permission dialog, which some version ago looks pretty similar like alert dialog, but it wasn't alert dialog, and Espresso cannot interact with it. So for both system features, we can use UI Automator framework or tweaked version of this framework to interact with system components. It's an important thing to remember when we speak about Android testing. The next things which is pretty important for us is to define what does it mean a good test case for us, which criteria should be matched for us. So first of all, it should be stable. We don't want to rerun this test case multiple times just to see that everything looks perfectly. Of course, it's not really interesting for us. We would like to run our test case and get great result. And of course, we expect this result pretty fast. We as a developer would like to develop more feature. We would like to have short feedback loop and get result as fast as we can. The next thing that of course it should be readable and extendable, because the biggest part of our time is reading code. And if we would like to add some features to our test framework, test library, or even for test infrastructure, we would like to do it super fast. For us, is not interesting framework which is super readable, but we will need to spend 5 hours to add just simple screen. And here I would like to talk a bit more about readability. So let's take a look at these two simple screens and what we expect. We would like to enter email password, press login, and go to the next screen. And when we read every line, everything looks pretty clear for us. But the main problem is that we should read line by line and understand it. And of course, it wouldn't be readable, especially if we will have test case, let's say for 5 or 10 screens. So in this case, what we, of course, would like to have is to a bit more readability. And the simplest approach for readability is, of course, add comments. But the main problem with this approach is that after some time it will be outdated, because one developer just to add code to incorrect section, forget to update comment, etc. So most probably it will be deprecated after some time. And of course, it's not really interesting for us. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at code which we have and think how can we improve it. So it's pretty simple espresso code. We just enter email, password, and press login. So ideally, we would like to have something like this. Very often it's called DSL, domain-specific language. It's when we create kind of language for interacting with our specific domain with our application. So for this approach, we can use robots patterns, which based on page object patterns, pretty famous in testing community. And first of all, I propose to extract all this basic operation for click on view, enter text, remove all text from some specific view to some our base operation layers. And later on, we can create some specific functionality for every screen. And here we will use our base operations. And as you can see, our screen code is completely independent from the framework. Here we don't use Espresso, we use just our abstraction. And of course, the latest step is to add functions with lambda as a parameters when we can execute every function from our login screen. If we take a look at big picture, we have our test case, we have our screen robots and basic operation. And as you can see, only basic operations are dependent on any of testing framework. And this is good approach, especially if you think that about migration to any other framework. Because if one day we decide to migrate from Espresso to UI Automator, only basic operations can be migrated. And many people told me that, yeah, but we use a framework, probably we will never migrate to another one. And here I completely disagree. Because I remember the time when people use one framework like Robotium, if anyone remember it. And later on, some people migrated to UI Automator, some people migrated to Appium, and others to Espresso. And right now, many of them migrated to a new version, to something like Espresso, Cacao, etc. Of course, you can choose one framework, but I highly recommend to choose widely framework if you would like to migrate everything to this framework. And right now, our new approach of building application is Jetpack Compose. And together with Jetpack Compose, we cannot really reuse fully similar approach and update only basic operations. Because with Jetpack Compose, we don't have ID anymore, but we can add a test tag modifier for specific views. And if we compare it with IDs, ID had an integer value, and right now all test tag has string value. So when we speak about migrating some screen to Compose, we need to also update basic operation, or most probably add new operations for Compose, and also update your screen robot, because in this case you should pass a tag instead of ID. But it's not about testing Jetpack Compose. It's about different approach in development that right now we don't have ideas anymore. And right now I would like to move to the biggest part of this talk, is challenges which we have in mobile testing. Because mobile testing has some specifications which not exist at all for, as example, web testing or desktop testing, and of course for backend testing. So first of all, I would like to start with approaches which had some requirement and can be easily solved by pixel perfectness tests or snapshot tests. And first of such approach is supporting verify that our application support greatly light and dark theme, because very often all application has it and all applications support it. When we talk about many, especially productivity app, for primary subscription, they support much more different themes. So, and of course, we would like to know that everything works perfectly. And it's a perfect example for view comparison test. And main idea of this approach that we run our test, do screenshot, save it in project, and when we do any change, our test case do another screenshot and compare it with origin. And if everything matches our test pass, if something is not matched, our test fails. And in report, we can see old and new screenshot, so we can decide if it was great change or not. In pretty similar approach, we can also test left to right and right to left layouts. We also can use view comparison test or screenshot test. When we speak about accessibility, and here we have a bit different side. First of all, we would like to know that everything works perfectly with different font size, display scaling, etc. And in addition, we also want to know that our application matches with all accessibility criteria. If we would like to test them manually, we can use accessibility scanner, which you can install on your device, scan every screen and see that everything is fine. Unfortunately, we can do it with Espresso accessibility dependency. And you can disable some accessibility check if different screen doesn't cover all accessibility requirements. When we speak about permissions, here recently, a couple of years ago, runtime permission was introduced. And in this moment, we have a bit more work for testing it. Because previously, when you install application, you already allow all permissions, and everything looks amazing here. But right now, your application should run without any crash, with all dependency, without all dependency, or with some particular dependencies. And of course, we really want to test it, and we want to know that our application looks great. We have no crash in any of this scenario. So here we have a couple of different approaches how we can test it. First of all, we can use ADB command to grant and revoke some permission. Other approach is to use a grant permission rule. But the main problem with grant permission rule is that we can grant all permissions, but we cannot revoke them using this rule. And the latest step is UI interaction, which in some cases is the most interesting option, because UI interaction allows us also to see that when we deny any permission, we can see some explanations or maybe message if we want to show it to explain user why do we need this permission, etc. And of course, the main problem for us here, how can we revoke all our permissions at the end of the test case? And one of options here is to use ADB command, which allows us to revoke any permission. And another option is to use Android Test Orchestrator, which will clean all data like database files, also permissions, after every test. But the main problem with this approach that if we really want to use it, we will lose some time after every test case, even when we already clean up everything. So here it's also, we should also really think, do we want to use Android Test Orchestrator, especially when we talk about efficiency. Very often use UI interaction plus ADB commands. So let's take a look what happened during every test case, because we have multiple test cases which can be executed in specific sequence, which I highly don't recommend, or randomly, but many of these test cases can interact with database, read or update any files. Or as an example, it also can change some shared preferences and any other data. And all this data stored in one folder, it's /data/package. And in this directory, we have couple of folders like databases, files, and shared preferences. And all this content, all our databases stored in these folders, shared preferences, the same. And some frameworks also provide some tools which can clean this data. As example, Barista library provides predefined rules which can clear data, like clear database rule, clear files rule, clear preference rule, etc. In this case, we also can clear all data after test case, because our main idea is to have this similar environment before and after test case. It's what we want to have. We really don't want to have a situation when one of our test case really depends on another one. We often really want to avoid this situation because it's one of reason of unstable test and a really simple step to the flakiness. And the next situation, which maybe we would like to cover, is interacting with our database. We can add any amount of data to our database, and after it, our user interface can look differently. Right now, offline first approach is pretty popular in mobile development area. And when we don't have internet connection, we interact with our database, get all data, do everything what we need with our data in database. And later on, we synchronize it with a server. When we speak about different approaches, how can we pre-populate data in our database, we can use, as example, queries. SQL query to our database, it will be super fast. Maybe we have in our test access to some repository or use cases, we can also use it. And one approach which I saw a couple of times, which was used pretty badly, is UI interaction. I really saw a test case which verifies that if you have more than 20 items, you had like show all button, or you can or you see pagination and not all data loaded. So what happened in this test case? The developer just write a test case which added via user interface 20 nodes, like enter text, press add, press add new node, and do the same 20 times. And of course, it was horrible because first of all, it's super long, especially if you want to check that you have specific UI element. Because if you do some performance testing, it's completely fine to have such scenario. But if you're not interested in adding your data to the database via user interface, you don't need to use such approach. You can use just query, you can add data via some dependencies, or you can just mock response from one of layers of your application. And if we do one step further, we can think, do we really want to use real data, or maybe fake data is a good option for us? And here we have some pros and cons for both of these approaches. And at the beginning, I would like to talk about using real data. And when we speak about using real data, we have two different scenarios. The first one is to use our production server. And the second option is to have dev environment, maybe short-lived environment for one day or for any time, but don't use production server. So with both of these approaches, usually we use latest available production environment. And of course, it's great because we test our changes with latest changes. The next step is that we have interaction with server. And it's great because we check that we work with latest environment, it's all criteria are matched and everything is perfect. But sometimes we can have complications. As example, that our server requires certificates, VPN, etc. And if it's required, our continuous integration also should be configured to provide a great environment for our test, especially if we need VPN. And the last problem is that from time to time, we need to synchronize our production server with dev server. If a new version of production environment was released, our dev environment also should be updated. Sometimes we would like to synchronize data between production and dev environment. And the last step, that it can be a bit tricky and complicated to always use production environment because it can be sometimes unstable. A state of our production server can be changed, etc. And we should remember to clean up our test data. And of course, we don't really want to store our test data in our production environment. So very often, if we use this approach, we have short-lived environment like dev server. And completely opposite approach is to use more fakes. If we want to, you can use, as example, WireMock, which replicate your server and send predefined responses. And in this case, our test will be really fast because we really don't depend on any limitations of our servers, network speed, VPNs, some security restrictions. Our test will be super fast and of course more stable because we can cover more different scenarios. When we send request, we can simulate any error from the backend, we can simulate incorrect data and cover much more scenarios how it can be verified. And of course, in this case, if new environment released with additional parameters in some request, of course, we should synchronize them and update it. And if we try to think even further in this approach, we can think what to choose, end-to-end test and functional test. Because in many projects, when QA team write test cases, very often everything started from end to end. So what's the main difference between these two approaches? Let's take a look at basic scenario. When we start from the splash screen, enter credential, press login, we go to the coffee drink screen and we do something with the screen. But as we remember, we would like to have similar environment, state of our environment before and after test. And it means that at the end of a test, we should log out to clear all data and to avoid situation when next test is started and instead of login screen, we already have, as example, coffee drink screen. So let's take a look at main idea of end-to-end tests. So first of all, very often entry point of end-to-end test is similar to entry point of application. It means that we most probably will interact with a server. And of course, we need to clean up some data after execution. However, we also can use with dev server and with mock server if everything is configured. When we speak about functional test, entry point of functional test can be any screen. Because main idea of this test is not to check how our application work with real environment. Main idea of functional test is to verify some view on the screen, to how it interact, how our UI works with different responses from the server, as example. And here usually we don't have navigation, and usually we use fake data here. And if we combine these two approaches, the main difference, which is interesting for us, it's main idea of test case. And for end-to-end test, it's slow verification of application, because very often we can have a lot of navigation. We use real environment or replica of this environment. And when we talk about functional test, we just want to check how our view looks and work, or how our screen looks and work. So entry point for functional test is required screen. For end-to-end test, it's of course very often similar to entry point of application. And I highly recommend to choose approach when you have majority of functional tests, which very often can use mock data, and you also have some of end-to-end tests, because you want to be sure that everything works perfectly with your production environment, not with your mocked response. So ideally, I highly recommend to combine both of these approaches. And the next big part of the talk is flaky test. And you always will have flaky test, especially if your application pretty complicated, if you work not only with local data, but with some backend third-party services, etc., because they can be unstable, or you can just don't have internet connection, your VPN connection can be broken, etc. Let's take a look at main categories of issues which can make our test flaky. And first of all, it's our external dependency. Let's take a look about them. So when we speak about external dependency, it's of course our network connection, it's network speed, because if you use your some of your environment like dev environments, it just can be unavailable, and all your tests just start failing because of this reason. The next category is framework. We often have framework issues because we often have new version of the framework. Some of them not so critical, some of them more critical. Many frameworks have really no idea how to deal with animations, how to deal with a view which can appear and disappear after some times, like toast, snack bar, etc. We can also have some problem with our device in emulator, especially if we do a lot of screenshot testing, because device memory just can over. You can also write your test, especially if you test not on test device but on real device, and some notification can pop up on top of the screen, and your test already will fail because your view below the pop-up. And of course, in some cases, it can be performance, and not even device performance, but very often it can be performance of USB ports when we talk about screenshot test, because all your files should be copied back to your laptop, as example. And in this case, performance of the device is also pretty important. And the last section is test case execution, when we can simulate different user actions. And as example, Expressor from time to time cannot click to the specific view, and we had some issue. But after a couple of milliseconds, it worked perfectly. The next thing is incorrect state before and after test case, when we forget to clean up our data, or we still have incorrect data and next test case is started. And it's all different categories. And if you have flaky test, I highly recommend to take a look at test case execution and external dependency sections, because very often you can find problem in this section. You can just forget to disable animations, as example. You maybe have some problem with your server. And in this case, I highly recommend to think maybe to replace some test cases from end to end, if you use them, to functional tests which will use fake data, and it's also something what can make your test more stable. And the last section is best practices which can be used for make our life easier. And of course, the first one is pay attention to naming, because one day your test case will fail, and it's much better to take a look on report and understand, oh, most probably I know why it's failing because I recently did some changes for it. The next big step is try to avoid any sleep in your test case, because when you use sleep, your device will wait a specific amount of the time. But when you use predefined methods for waiting, which are available in multiple frameworks, you can wait something between 200 milliseconds and 5 seconds. And for some test cases, it can be just 200 milliseconds. For another, it's 1 second. And for the third one, it will be just 3 seconds. But still, you don't wait all the time for your timeout. And of course, all your test cases should be independent, because it will be pretty bad practice if you have like preparation test case which adds some data to database and next 5 test case will use it. The main problem of this approach is that if this preparation test case will fail, at the end the next 5 test cases also will fail, and you should rerun a lot of them. Very often people think, okay, UI tests or instrumentation tests are pretty slow, so it will be great if I can add much more different steps to one test, and it will verify navigation, different screens, do screenshots for 5 screens and everything in one test. And most probably this test case will be flaky, because such test case try to do too much and has pretty high risk to be a flaky, because something can go wrong. So in this case, I highly recommend to split such test case, one huge test case, into a couple of smaller ones. And in this case, do navigation separately, do screenshot testing separately. Maybe it will be a bit longer, but most probably it wouldn't be much longer, because for navigation, you can start from the very beginning. For screenshot test, you can just start from a specific screen. You don't need to do all navigations, especially that right now we have a great tooling which allows us to run specifically every fragment, every composable function, and every specific activity. Do not spend time on navigating if you don't need it. If you would like to test specific screen, just test specific screen. Run this fragment, I would say, and just cover it with test. Do not start from the very beginning. The next issue, try to follow no flaky test policy, because of course some frameworks like Barista allows you to mark your test cases like allow flaky, an amount of attempts, how often your test can rerun if it fails. But the main problem with this approach, if you do it 1 time, 5 times, it will be normal practice, and you will do it more and more often. And at the end, execution time of your test cases increase too much, and it will be pretty complicated to cover it. And do not rely only on test automation, especially people who just start writing UI tests. They think, okay, I can automate everything. I highly recommend think if you can verify it easily as a QA, as a developer, and don't write UI tests. As example, with animation, it's not easy to test animation with Android, because all espresso-based framework highly recommend to disable all of your animations. So in this case, I highly recommend to cover what's the most important, and I would say animations can be checked by developer and by QA engineer before approving these methods, especially that many of us, or almost all of us, do pull requests, and people usually install application to check if everything is fine. And my final, and I really like this tip, is learn your tool. Do you use any specific tool or framework? Just read some documentation, watch some conference talk. If you update a dependency of your framework, just take a look on the changelog, because maybe you will find that new function was introduced, and you can remove small part of your code base because framework already support it. Especially that frameworks evolving from time to time, and where often we have new releases. So I highly recommend learn your tools, check your change logs. And this is all. Thank you for listening. I hope it was helpful.